My talk is called Women's Leadership, the Right to Care, and Revolutionary Reforms in the United States. I also see this paper as trying to answer the question that Frigga Haag raised at the very introduction of this conference. How should we position ourselves as Marxist-Feminist to do our feminist activism within our socialist activism? And I will talk today to highlight the leadership of women in the U.S. social formation, in organizing against imperialism and war, the racist criminal justice system, and for racial, gender, economic, and environmental justice. Although male organizers are also important, women play a key symbolic, ideological, and practical role in challenging the intertwined patriarchies and white supremacy in the historical block of U.S. capitalism. This is so for two reasons. One is material, and one is ideological. The material reason is the care crisis occurring in the U.S. neoliberal capitalist system. First, I'll talk about the material effects of that care crisis. Then I will discuss its gendered ideological contradictions. Lastly, I will talk about the strategic implications for socialist feminist organizing. And I will use as an example the work of a community group that I work with called Arise for Social Justice. So the care crisis in the U.S. today. More than half of U.S. women are working in the paid labor force. The prevalence of joint breadwinner and single-parent family households, that is, the fact that there is no longer any, the majority are not in nuclear families with just a male breadwinner, has made it increasingly difficult for families to find the time to cover the unpaid care work necessary for young children, the sick, and elders. Neoliberal cutbacks in state welfare services, including the lack of affordable child care, health care, and elder care, have created a huge strain on families. Right now, only 13% of Americans have access to paid family leave. Only 37% have personal medical leave provided through an employer. So if you're sick, you still have to go to work. More than 1/6 of the US population has no health coverage at all in the richest country in the world. 1/4 of all those living below the poverty line in the US are there because of the birth of a new baby. The US is one of the only advanced capitalist countries in the world that does not offer paid leave to new mothers. Affordable child care is a major problem. Only 3 in 10 working families have access to it. So one typical working class mother writes to the feminist group Moms Rising, this is the quote, for the first 9 months of my son's life, I was lucky to have my mother watch him. When my mother decided to go back to school, I had to find childcare. My husband and I are both employed full-time, but we can barely afford childcare and we do not qualify for any state assistance. This care deficit in communities has resulted in an increase in the exploitation of immigrant domestic workers, third shift and absent parenting, gang membership, community violence, and an increase in homeless elderly. While non-unionized, low-paid care workers must usually work several jobs to support their own families, even more unpaid work has devolved onto women as parents and community volunteers. Feminist and leftist organizers need to show how neoliberal, racialized capitalist patriarchy is responsible for this care crisis, and to challenge the right fundamentalist position, the right-wing political position, that such lack of care is due to irresponsible women who avoid childcare, and caregiving, and also their view that the crisis is due to oversexed people of color having children they cannot take care of. As a materialist feminist, I agree with Sarah Carpenter, who points out that the most radical aspects of Western feminist struggles have been with the bourgeois state over reproduction and sexual freedom. So these include struggles over sexuality, such as the struggles against rape, against sexual violence, for privacy, on sex work and on queerness, rights to queerness, also to control our labor power, rights to contraception, abortion, health care, and against sterilization, and to acknowledge the value of reproductive labor, whether in paid or unpaid work. So Carpenter argues that these struggles are unwinnable in a capitalist system. And so in my way of framing her point, this means that they involve revolutionary demands that imply a radical anti-capitalist vision. So our anti-patriarchal socialist vision of the democratic control of reproductive needs to encompass not only women, but women, men, and trans people in a revolutionary reorganization of the gender vision of reproductive labor. So we need this radical vision. It has to be highlighted in our organizing work to achieve what I call empowerment reforms in the here and now to strengthen and expand our communities and their networks. So ideologically, the second point, women's paid or unpaid caregiving work as wives, mothers, partners, as well as service workers has always been at odds with the me-first, self-interested, bourgeois individualist values prevalent in mainstream U.S. history. Although most U.S. women are now working in either full or part-time wage work, the previous ideology of the male breadwinner and the female housewife still holds sway symbolically. The self-made entrepreneur of the American dream is still seen as a masculine individual to be contrasted with the altruistic, maternal, caring, feminine women. So when women organize as women against war, against police racism that destroys young men and women in their communities, for workers' rights, for housing, or against the environmental pollution threatening their communities, they're creating in each of these struggles a new political demand around a right to care, not only a right to give care, but a right to be cared for, and not only by women or the family, but by and for the community and the state. So elsewhere, as Kathy Russell pointed out, I have argued for a materialist feminism which maintains their effective economies associated with different economic modes of production, such as capitalism and feudalism. And Nancy Holmstrom talked about this as a kind of dual systems theory. And I argue that these semi-autonomous systems of creating and exchanging emotional, sexual, and affectionate body and energies and pleasure, as well as reproducing children, lodge different forms of patriarchy. And some of these effective economies have also been marked by racialization, institutional racism of communities segregated from others by race and ethnicity, which have denied populations of color the same reproductive rights and loving, caring spaces as white populations. So in other work, I won't have time to talk about this. I've talked about historical transitions between different types of patriarchy and patriarchal effective economies, from father patriarchy to husband patriarchy to, in the US, our present state of public patriarchy, where men in corporations and the state control women and families. And this, of course, means somewhat different in different populations where some of these patriarchies coexist. But what I want to talk about now is the contradiction in the present organization of the contemporary capitalist patriarchal effective economy about this care crisis. And I think that provides an opportunity for a Marxist-Feminist strategy for challenging this situation, since ideologically, women are seen as the caregivers in these effective economies, demands to meet material needs to give and receive care are a good strategic place to organize women who have been taught these skills and priorities as part of our practical gender interest, using Maxine Molyneux's notion. So when the traditional demand for private and wifely care is expanded to include care for the community, it becomes a demand for a revolutionary reform that should be promoted by women's leadership in all forms of radical struggle. In the US, with its history based in settler imperialism, slavery, and institutionalized racism, in education, housing, citizen rights, and the criminal justice system, it's particularly important for class and race-based organizing strategies that tie anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-capitalist movements together to create oppositional communities. And these need to be marked by alliances between radical women in these communities. So I want to now make the distinction between revolutionary and empowerment reforms, or sometimes called reformist reforms. So what is this distinction? Following Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, Andre Gortz argues that most trade union demands are reformist reforms. They don't threaten the system itself, nor the ability of the capitalist class to maintain its power. Demands for shorter work weeks, higher pay, paid vacations, and even a living wage are examples of such reformist reforms. These can be contrasted to non-reformist reforms. I call these revolutionary reforms, which can't be achieved without undermining key power relations in the present capitalist system. Such reforms involve structural changes which would decentralize existing political and economic power in a revolutionary, democratic direction. So I maintain that radical organizing struggles need to articulate both reformist or empowerment demands as well as non-reformist or revolutionary demands. Empowerment demands are for short-term, winnable reforms that will better people's lives, so they have the energy to struggle for revolutionary demands. As Nora Russell argues, workers should engage in revolutionary reformism. That is, struggles for reforms to meet immediate survival needs, but always with a program that envisages the need for more revolutionary changes. Revolutionary reforms would change important practical forms of life, including effective and material relations between people from more privatized, debilitating, and hostile relations to more joyous, communal, democratic, and solidaristic ones. Single mothers, the poor, old people, queers, and those of color and ethnic minorities would not be segregated and isolated from others in the community. This change would allow for a greater sense of solidarity and effective networks through which to act, and therefore enhance community feeling. More egalitarian distribution of material and other human goods and education, health, housing, welfare, transportation, job opportunities, clean environment, reproductive control to all individuals and communities would give all a joint stake in human flourishing. Second, revolutionary reforms which refuse commodified and hierarchical ways of controlling production and reproduction would allow human societies to more successfully meet the human potential that Marx noted for free, creative, productive activity among the associated producers, and as Marxist-Feminists can add, among freely associated reproducers. So now I'm going to turn briefly to discuss more concretely an example of a radical community organizing group led by women in the US. Arise for Social Justice is its name, in Springfield, Massachusetts. It does anti-capitalist organizing around the care crisis, and it shows the importance of radical women's leadership. Arise is a multiracial, poor women's rights community group working in a city near me whose population is 30% of color. They have 4 paid women staff, and they are all from the low-income community. They do advocacy for homeless people, for tenants' rights, for democratic political representation of the poor, against racism in the criminal justice system, and for environmental justice. Their board members include members from other organizations, such as the group Out Now, who advocate for the rights of queer youth of color, and the group No One Leaves, who organize against housing foreclosures by banks, and also a representative from the Progressive Jobs for Justice Trade Union Coalition. Arise advocates for rights to housing both for the homeless and to defend the legal rights of poor renters. In their work with homeless people who are often single mothers or poor families with children, Arise uses a knowledge of the U.S. welfare state system to find them temporary and permanent housing, food, transportation, and schooling. They also work with low-income renters to advise them of their rights against exploitative landlords. Demands for housing, food, and schooling are examples of demands for empowerment reforms. Obviously, those with housing problems are empowered as individuals to pursue more revolutionary reforms if they have a place to sleep and some food. Other examples of empowerment reforms that Arise organizes around include feminist education around women's rights against domestic and sexual violence, and for adequate health care and child nutrition programs. A revolutionary reform that Arise works with is the demand for affordable housing for all. Arise is a part of a national city organizing group in the US called Rights to the City, which demands, and they demand particularly that the city of Springfield set up a land trust to buy unoccupied housing and create new affordable housing. In a city that has more than 1,500 vacant homes due to problems with a hurricane, so they're uninhabitable, or foreclosures. So there are all these homeless and all these vacant houses. And so in contemporary US finance capitalism, where such housing for the poor is less and less available, where the unemployment of racial minorities in this city is about 50%, a land trust would be a revolutionary reform because it takes housing off the capitalist market and socializes it so the owners pay an affordable amount for tenancy rights, but when sold, the house reverts back to the trust to sell at an affordable price. Such a trust creates a new category between public and private property, so it undermines capitalist binaries and power relations structured on the market. Another example of Arise's mix of revolutionary and empowerment reforms is their Criminal Injustice Liberation Committee that advocates abolishing mass incarceration and the police as we know them, but also works to struggle to change punitive parole requirements for former prisoners and to allow them voting rights. They also advocate for particular people who have been unjustly imprisoned. In their environmental justice work, Arise demands that a biomass incinerator not be sited in Springfield, which already has the highest rate of childhood asthma in the state. They are also demanding a climate justice city position to create city plans to deal with the impending climate crisis, and are part of a climate justice coalition, which demands the revolutionary reform to eliminate fossil fuel energy altogether, which, as Kathy Russell has pointed out, has been also a basic part of US capitalism since its development in the 19th century in the Standard Oil Trust. So Marxist feminists need to find ways to connect to social movements and organizations that are creating alliances around these issues of racial, economic, and gender justice. Arise, for example, works to develop a united front as a mixed-race ally for racial justice groups of color, and here's an example. In Springfield, recently there was a rally organized by the local Black Lives Matter and the NAACP, as well as several black ministers and religious groups, and Arise helped organize that. The most impressive speakers were women of color. One gave a leftist critique of US imperialism, which faulted our military and industrial complex using tax dollars for oil wars in the Middle East. She also critiqued our racist mass incarceration state where violent police are not accountable to citizens. So as has been mentioned, women organizers have been at the forefront of Black Lives Matter and the leftist movement for Black lives that has come out of this. This has been against the racist criminal justice incarceration system, started really by Black women. It's also emphasized the importance of defending trans people's rights and gay people's rights as members, valued members of minority communities of color. And they're all demanding in various ways the right to care and be cared for, which challenges American individualism and attention to only oneself and one's family. The care crisis can't be overthrown without overthrowing the present order. So achieving care really requires a strong community which cares for its vulnerable other and extends cares to overlapping communities, which demand change in the new U.S. neoliberal security state. So in conclusion, the demands of such a alliance include as their most revolutionary worker-owned and managed businesses, a basic income for all, abolishing prisons in favor of restorative justice, abolishing police as we know them, and ending all housing foreclosures. Solidarity groups of white people with majority women leadership have developed to oppose institutionalized racism, such as SURGE. Kathy talked about that group. And so we need multiracial and ethnic alliances led by strong women leaders to motivate and educate for these revolutionary reforms that center around the right and care to care and be cared for both individually and in our communities in order to achieve our Marxist-Feminist vision. Thanks.